Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. Let's continue our top stories this afternoon, talking about a case that has captured national attention. Putting this up on your screen, some of the footage that we have as week one is now coming to a close in the Karen Read trial. So, of course, you may have heard the name, but do you know the lore behind the woman? Karen Read is currently facing second-degree murder charges in the January 2022 death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe. We do know that Reed pleaded not guilty to allegedly ramming O'Keefe with her Lexus SUV and then leaving him to die in a snowstorm following a drunken argument. Last year, the judge declared a mistrial after jurors were unable to reach a verdict, and the defense is claiming that the police are now framing Karen Read. And we've been seeing reaction from folks there outside of the courthouse as well as on social media. And the retrial, again, week one is now coming to a close. And to talk a lot more about this, I want to bring into the conversation Flint McColgan. He is the reporter there with the Boston Herald. Flint, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. It's great to have you here on our program to talk about this specifically because you've been covering this case for several years, top to bottom. Folks may even recognize you from that Max documentary as well that Karen was featured in.
Yes, I've been covering it for more than 3 years now, ever since Karen Read's lower court arraignment before the indictment.
And so first, as we're starting out this week, the retrial, let's just start with some of the basics if someone is not following the case as closely. She's facing the same charges this time around. Can you talk to how this trial is looking just, though, a bit different from the one that first happened last year?
Sure, yeah, she's facing the same charges. The key one is second-degree murder. She's also charged with manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle and leaving the scene of a collision causing death. So she's accused of killing her Boston police officer boyfriend, John O'Keefe, who they've been dating about 2 years. She was tried last year. What's different now is that there is a new lead prosecutor, Hank Brennan, most famous for being mobster Whitey Bulger's defense attorney back in the day in this federal case. And definitely the structure is looking a lot different under him. Since the last trial, the defense has tried to remove the charges of second-degree murder and leaving the scene of an accident or a collision causing death because they said that jurors came forward to say that they actually were ready to acquit on that. They were only hung on the manslaughter charge. But so far, the courts have not agreed that that was tantamount to a verdict. So we're going forward with all 3 charges.
And we're watching some of the video as well that's been used in court. And you mentioned Hank Brennan as well, the new lead in the prosecutor's side of this case. But let's take a step back and really talk about what's happening there inside of the courtroom this week. This case, again, we've been talking about the national attention. What is it like inside? Because from what I hear, that Dedham, Massachusetts courtroom is smaller than most people might think. Can you describe what the atmosphere is like inside and how that may have an impact as well for those jurors?
Yeah, it is certainly smaller. There's actually a larger courtroom in the same courthouse that it was originally going to be held on. But before the last trial, the defense said that certain jurors wouldn't be able to see the expressions of witnesses testifying because the boxes overlap. And so they asked for a different courtroom, and now we're all stuck in a much smaller one. But I would say that despite being packed in like sardines, and it's very warm in there because of all the bodies in a small room, that things actually don't seem as tense or chaotic this time around. The protests are even farther from the courthouse now than they were last year.
And so when we're talking about even what the jurors are going to be focusing on, I remember even there was a point in that documentary, you all were talking about how the jurors, when they were inside deliberating some of those very serious charges, they could hear those protesters, those fans of Karen Read, if you want to call them that, outside chanting for her freedom while they were trying to decide what her fate was going to be.
Yes, so the courthouse is actually on quite a busy street, even though Dedham, the town it's in, is a suburb. It's right on the main street of Dedham, so we're hearing fire trucks, we're hearing ambulances, and yes, Prosecutor Brennan in pretrial hearings did bring up that that the protesters, despite there being a buffer zone, were still close enough to where jurors would be able to hear their chants of "Free Karen Read, Free Karen Read," and that could have an influence on them. So he asked for the buffer zone to be larger this time around, and Judge Beverly Cannoni granted that. So they are pushed back a little bit farther, at least on one side of the courthouse where they tended to congregate.
And let's talk about what's different as well as far as the interviews that have been done and sort of the evidence that's been submitted to court this time around. This time around, Karen has done several sit-down interviews with several different news organizations. And again, we've mentioned the documentary that was also held on Max as well. How was this being used in the courtroom this time around? Because from what I understand, they have it set up with several screens as well, and the audio is pumped up so folks can really hear and listen to some of these statements that she's made outside of the courtroom, though choosing to never get on the stand in her first trial.
Certainly, that is one of the main things that looks different. I mentioned that there's a different structure this time around. In his opening statement, Brennan actually, toward the end of it, played a portion of Karen Reed interview because she did a lot. She really gave tons of access to that documentary I was in that you mentioned, and as well as a bunch of other ones. And in the clip, you know, he played, she was speculating on, whether she could have possibly hit him. So, and saying that, did I hit him? Could I have clipped him? That type of thing. So, and it really just kind of worked to hammer home his main point, which is that first responders have testified that they heard her say, I hit him at the scene. In those interviews, she's speculating that she said, could I have hit him? But regardless, it's a major prosecution point that she may have admitted to it at the scene. And he's playing clips that back that up.
And I want to play out one of those moments as well there in the jury room when one of those witnesses who was on the stand took back a statement that she said in that original trial. Let's listen into that.
And that was a false statement, wasn't it?
Technically.
Technically?
Yes.
And that was a lie, correct?
Objection.
Was that a lie? Did you lie? I did not intentionally.
It's impressive to hear her say that on the witness stand this time around. And we've been talking about how valuable these witnesses have been in this case so far. These are the only people who were there the night of John O'Keefe's death and the morning after as they're trying to search for him before they came across his body there in the front lawn. What was the reaction to hearing her make that statement this week? I feel like that's one of the biggest moments to come out of court.
Certainly, it's a big one. So she was the second witness called, which is really accelerating the timeline from the last trial because we heard 6 days of testimony from first responders, all practically saying the same thing. It was very snowy, and that she may have said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. So anyway, we've got Carrie Roberts. Who Carrie Roberts is one of the two women, along with Reed, who discovered O'Keefe's body either dead or dying on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road. And this particular piece of testimony that we heard, that she was like, I didn't mean to lie, or what, taking that back, is that she had testified previously that Jennifer McCabe, the other of the three women there, had that Karen Reed had told Jennifer McCabe to look up hypothermia, how long someone could die in the cold. And this is absolutely central to the defense's theory that there is a cover-up, that Karen Reed is innocent, that someone else killed John O'Keefe, left him there, and is framing her. So, to explain that briefly, the defense will later, it hasn't come up in this trial yet, but talk about how Jennifer McCabe may have actually done a search for how long to die in cold. There's a typo, it's Haas long, but how long to die in cold at, in the 2 o'clock hour, hours before John O'Keefe was found, thus indicating, prior knowledge of this, of his fate. And she says, no, she did it around 6 a.m. when Karen Reed asked her to. So this is really going to be a he said, she said type of thing later on in the trial.
And it'll be something that we're continuing to watch and watch it unfold there in the courtroom. Flint, before I let you go, any final thoughts talking about how we're going into week 2? We also know today was a big day where those jurors were able to visit the site as well, where they found John O'Keefe's body laying. Can you go into that a bit?
Yes, so they took it's a view. They went to 34 Fairview Road in Canton. It's a quiet suburban street, and that's where John O'Keefe's body, well, dead or dying, was found. in a snowstorm by those three women. That's 6 a.m. January 29th, 2022. So jurors got to see that property as well as Karen Reed's Lexus SUV that prosecutors say she used to kill him. So that was a big day. Also today in testimony, we have who was the chief pathologist of the hospital that John O'Keefe was taken to, that Karen Reed was taken to for a psych eval, and he did a blood test, and he found what's pretty much, he did a serum ethanol test, and his findings translate to about a 0.09% ABV, and this would be hours after prosecutors say that she hit John O'Keefe. So that's well over the legal limit, even hours later. So that is a big bit of testimony today.
Certainly was. And so, again, we've had Flint McColgan here to help us break down everything that's happening with the Karen Reed trial. And again, anything anticipated for next week that we should really be paying attention to, any witness that are on the list that we should be on the lookout for.
Well, as I said, they're really switching up the structure here, so it's hard to predict who they're going to call next, even though I was there in the last trial. But looking ahead, it's going to be a half day for jurors, but it's going to be a longer day for us watching from home, or like me covering in the courtroom, because on Monday, it may be a half day of testimony, but there will be questioning of future defense witnesses from a company called ARCA, who testified in the last trial that there's no way O'Keefe could have been hit by a car. And so the prosecution wants to limit what they can testify to, and the prosecution said that the defense has blown past all kinds of deadlines about what they need to share about this. So this is really going to set the parameters to what they're allowed to testify to later in the trial.
And it certainly will be something that we're continuing to monitor as well here on Live Now from Fox. Again, with the Boston Herald, Flint McColgan, we appreciate your time, and we wish you the best of luck as you continue to cover this trial there in Massachusetts.
Okay, thanks for having me.
All right, we certainly appreciate Flint for joining us here on Live Now from Fox to break down all of the ins and outs of week one of this murder trial. Of course, you know, you've probably heard Karen Reed's name, her defense attorney saying that this is an elaborate scheme to set her up for the death of her Boston police officer boyfriend. Of course, this is the second trial in this case. There was a mistrial that was found last July in the summer. And if you haven't been aware of some of the things that have been going on, again, we are now in week one of this retrial. It's wrapped up. It's a lot that has changed, as we just heard from Flint McColgan. He's been there inside of the courtroom, listening in as those witnesses have been taking the stand. There was that bombshell moment earlier this week when one of those key witnesses from the first trial admitted to lying on the stand, saying that she did not intentionally lie, but did misremember some of those things. So this trial certainly has a lot of elements to it. Earlier today, we do know that the jurors were able to leave the courtroom, visiting Canton, Massachusetts, the address where they say that Reed was accused of deliberately striking her Boston police officer boyfriend, John O'Keefe, with her SUV and then leaving him to die in the snow back in January of 2022. We're going to be diving into a bit more on this case, as it has been getting a lot of national attention. We'll be speaking next with a legal analyst to talk about what the path forward looks like for Karen Reed, for prosecutors, what's really changed on the legal side in this case. Stay right here with us on Live Now from Fox. Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. As promised before we went to that 2-minute break, we're going to continue to break down the very latest as it pertains to the Karen Reed murder retrial. So we do want to show you this live look that we have there in Boston, Massachusetts at this time. They're on the East Coast quickly. They're approaching the 7 o'clock hour. But as you can see, we've been following this case and some of the ins and outs as it has changed so much, as this is the second time that Karen is now accused of murdering her ex-boyfriend, John O'Keefe. To bring into the conversation now, I want to talk with our legal analyst, Jacqueline Goodman. Jacqueline, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Happy to be here.
And of course, again, we've been talking about Karen Reed. We know that you've been following the case as well. From the outside looking in, Let's just first talk about the aspect of this case that might be the most difficult for the defense. This is a retrial on the same charges after that mistrial happened last summer. Can you sort of talk through what it's like after you've sort of laid out a game plan that you hoped to get your client off those charges last year, now having to do the same thing once again?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that are more difficult for the defense. Typically, statistically, retrials favor the prosecution. And the reason for that is that as much as defense lawyers are noble and we are the last friend to the most reviled and all of those things, liberty's last champion, we are still agents of chaos. And when it comes to those trials, the surprise, that element of surprise, is always favorable to the defendant. So now the prosecution has heard this story. One of the weaknesses in the first case was the lack of evidence of third-party culpability, that is, that someone else killed the decedent. And so the prosecution has had time now to truly dissect the defense theory and make the most of the weaknesses in that theory, the lack of evidence to support that theory, and the rest of the evidence that points toward Karen Read's guilt. The other thing is that in the interim, since the mistrial in the first instance, Karen Read has gone on a, publicity tour, so to speak, and she has made lots of statements, including an entire documentary. And so they will be able to use those statements to have plenty of time to prepare because she's not even on the stand. She was making these statements ahead of this trial. And so they can prepare with that testimony, use it if they need to, even if she doesn't take the stand in this case, but really use that in order to prepare their case in this instance. And so the prosecution looks like they're changing it up just a little bit.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that's such a key factor. Of course, in that first trial, while in the process of making that documentary, maybe you watched the one that was on Max. That's where we were able to just talk to Flint McColgan. He was there with the Boston Herald, a part of that very documentary that broke down the behind the scenes of everything the defense was doing leading up to that trial. They had to know, though, that there was some possibility that this could have been the case. And would it have been better if their client, Karen Read, had chosen to stay silent until after this was all put behind her?
It's fascinating, isn't it? They had to decide, is it better to put this narrative out? I mean, they were speaking to potential jurors. Let's just face it. As much as we might ethically say otherwise, I think that the defense had to know that they were speaking to potential jurors in the next case. And so they were giving their defense narrative, and that comes at a cost. Because now all of the information about the defense work in this case and all of the negatives, too, will come out before that trial. So it's a double-edged sword. We do have her statements. She's speaking to those jurors. She's telling them her narrative without actually having to take the stand and being cross-examined in front of those jurors. But there are some drawbacks to this, for sure.
And what's also different about this trial, Jacqueline, is that there's a new special prosecutor on the case, Hank Brennan. He's now taking the reins from the last prosecutor who did end up with that trial ending in a mistrial. What are your thoughts on now having a new prosecution on this case? Does that give them an edge? I know you said that typically in retrials, the prosecution is already favored. What happens when they decide to switch out that as well?
It does give the prosecution an edge. I mean, I think that it just gives more of an edge to the prosecutor because the downside to the prosecution is that they really do have to put all their cards on the table, and the defense can really kind of look at what they're seeing from the prosecutor and make decisions in the moment. And the prosecutor has to react to those things. Here, you do have something of an element of surprise for the defense. You have not exactly the same playbook for the prosecution. And so it just really kind of adds, I think, to the difficulty for the prosecution. The difficulty for the defense in this retrial.
And it will be interesting to see how everything has been covered as well. Let's talk about the media aspect, because I think that's also just a huge thing. We've talked about the fact that they were speaking to potential jurors in between the time when she was sort of doing these interviews. But the amount of people who show up and support Karen outside of the courthouse, does that have any impact on those jurors who have to get up every day, walk inside, and see both of those sides facing off ahead of them before they go in to listen to the story from the defense, the story from the prosecution, and have to make that decision ultimately of what to do with Karen Read in her life?
Absolutely. And it's an astute observation. People outside of that courtroom, many of whom are saying, free Karen Read, are going to have an impact on these jurors. They will always think they don't know as much as other people do. There's not this kind of support for a criminal defendant in a trial very often. So being a part of that national conversation is going to weigh heavy on these jurors, and they're going to really, I think, take to heart the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. I think they're really going to have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's part of the reason why the defense did do those, the documentary, and did make those statements to keep this information alive in the public, so that there is this kind of, groundswell of support around the courthouse. Generally speaking, when a jury has the understanding or an inclination that this is a retrial, they sometimes tend to think, I better get it right because the first jury couldn't do it. And that tends to favor a prosecution in that sense. Now, you really have this other counterbalance to that narrative where the public seems to be saying, we think that there's something wrong. And the jurors are going to have that in the back of their minds, whether they try to ignore that or not. It's going to be part of what they're thinking about when they're deliberating. I think they're going to be extra careful to hold the prosecution to their burden.
And I have to say, Jacqueline, what comes to mind is the Menendez brothers in this situation. Of course, we know they had two separate trials that ended up with them behind bars for more than 30 years, now pleading to get out there in California as well. So when we're looking ahead to Karen and what she needs to be focused on, and what, as a defense attorney, what would you be suggesting for her mindset and sort of how she should present herself in court? Are the facial expressions important that she displays? Should she be talking back and forth to some of her family members that are allowed to be there in the courtroom? Does any of that impact how they see her?
Absolutely. If she's not going to be taking the stand, then they're going to make every inference based on what they see. I always tell my clients it's a silent movie, and every possible minute you've got to be aware that this jury is making these assumptions about you, and they don't have any volume. So you have to be comporting yourself to whatever you want them to think about you. So whether you smile, whether you laugh at some moment of levity in the courtroom and kind of make eye contact with a juror in those few moments that always are part of any trial, even the most serious trials, whether, you sort of overreact to things, how you look, if you emote, if you look like you're nervous, if you look like you're concerned, if you look like somebody you love just died, all of those things are part of what the jury is putting together to make an assessment of you. And that's absolutely important, especially if she doesn't take the stand.
How common is it that the same judge is over a retrial case like this as well? Because we know that that's been the case right now for Karen Read.
It's pretty common, but what isn't common is that some of these rulings have been quite different. Typically, a judge presides over the first trial, listens to the arguments on both sides of any particular legal issue, and decides whether certain evidence is admissible or not admissible, or how people should be behaving outside of the courthouse. And then you have the same judge doing the trial over again, and typically they're going to be thinking the same thing. In this case, you have that trial judge who is making some quite different rulings, and one of them significantly is to limit the amount of third-party culpability evidence that the defense can bring in. And some might argue that that's putting the judge's thumb on the scale a bit in favor of the prosecution. But absolutely, there is less evidence that the court is allowing the defense. They've just got less leeway to come in and try to point the finger of guilt at some other third party, some other unknown third party. This time, that's limited, and that's going to make a huge difference.
And so we're just kind of looking at some of the footage from inside court today. Karen Read's family has been on hand the same way they were in the first trial, the same as though John O'Keefe's family sitting right to the opposite of that as well. Before I let you go, I have to ask you, what is the impact of the families being there, their faces, hearing some of the evidence and hearing how the prosecution and the defense attorneys speak in court? Does that have any effort? What weight does it ultimately hold?
Oh, it holds a tremendous amount of weight. People are emotional, and they think in terms of narratives. And so they're going to be looking at Karen Read, and when she's supported by other family members, that is going to, at least to some degree, and with some of those jurors, make them feel like they do understand her, they do identify with her, they think of her as their daughter or their spouse or their sister. And, they do also emote for an alleged victim or for a victim in a case, but they can't stop that from happening. It's already happened. And so here we're talking about support from a woman who looks like every other woman that they've seen in their lives. They are going to be feeling sorry. There's no guilt for the family members of Karen Read. And so they're going to be feeling emotional and sorry for the parents, for her family members that are clearly the innocent victims in all of this as well. And so I think that does play a part with these jurors.
And so we've been watching as those moments are happening and unfolding there in court. Before I let you go, Jacqueline Goodman, legal analyst, helping us to break it down. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, isn't it? This trial, it doesn't follow the way most retrials go, because usually we know the rules of the road, and now we can just sort of fit in this one different variable. Here, it's all brand new. There are so many new variables. It's really fascinating. It's going to be interesting to see how it goes.
It certainly will, and we'll be watching here on Live Now from Fox. Again, legal analyst Jacqueline Goodman here to help us break down the very latest as it pertains to Karen Reed's first week of her retrial wrapping up. We appreciate you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right.